A nurse at a night hospital is tasked with taking a patient who has been declared dead to the morgue, but on the way, she notices strange movements. Upon investigating, she discovers that the patient is still alive, but there is one disturbing detail. The man seems to have woken up with no memory. Before we move on to the story, tell us where you've seen it in the comments. Our community is growing every day. To be part of it, subscribe to our channel. And if you like the videos, don't forget to share them with your loved ones. Now let's begin with the story of the man who lost his memory. Catalina, a nurse at a small hospital in Texas, wiped her tired hands with a damp cloth, barely managing to keep her eyes open after another long night. The clock on the wall read almost 3 a.m., and the cold hospital corridors were shrouded in a heavy, almost oppressive silence. She was getting ready to leave when a colleague with a face that showed he didn't want to be there entered the room. "Catalina, before you go, I need you to take a body to the morgue." "It's the unidentified body," he said, avoiding her gaze. She sighed, trying to hide her annoyance. They always gave her these tasks at the end of her shift. "Unidentified?" she asked, and her colleague just nodded slightly. As she approached the stretcher in the isolation room, she saw the man. His face was pale and his expression seemed more like pain than peace. Her heart sank. Who was he? How had he ended up there alone with no one to mourn his passing? Catalina adjusted the sheets around the body, her hands hesitating for a moment. "I'm sorry, whoever you are," she whispered as if talking to an old friend, then began to push the stretcher. What had happened to that man? Why did no one know his name? Those questions echoed in Catalina's mind as she walked through the deserted hallways, feeling that something about that night, something about that body, was not right. The hospital corridors were shrouded in a terrifying gloom, lit only by a few flickering lights on the ceiling. Catalina pushed the stretcher slowly, the sound of the wheels echoing like a lonely lament. The air felt colder than normal, and an unsettling feeling began to grow inside her, as if something invisible were watching her as she moved forward. She tried to divert her thoughts. Perhaps she was just too tired. However, the moment she turned one of the corners of the hallway, the silence was broken by an unexpected sound. It was low, almost imperceptible. It sounded like a muffled moan. Catalina stopped abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, hoping to find a colleague playing a joke, but the hallway was empty. Only her, the lifeless body on the stretcher, and that strange sound, which now repeated itself more faintly, like a lost sigh. Resting her hands on the wall to try to calm herself, Catalina swallowed hard. Was she hearing things? Perhaps it was just the noise of movement, or a reflection of the overwhelming silence that surrounded her. But what if it wasn't? Her gaze turned to the man under the sheet. He was motionless, and she had seen him as pale as marble, but something made her lean over slowly with trembling hands to check. "You're alive," she whispered, almost without realizing she was speaking aloud. The sound repeated itself, a little clearer this time. It was a real moan. Catalina recoiled, a chill running down her spine. Could it be possible? No. He had been declared dead. The doctors couldn't be wrong about something like that, could they? She stood motionless, her mind caught between fear and the need to act. Trembling, Catalina took a deep breath and leaned over the body, her throat dry. Her fingers hesitated as they touched the sheet, and she repeated to herself, "It must be a mistake. It can't be what I'm thinking." She carefully pulled back the fabric, revealing the man's face. He looked as still as before, but there was something she couldn't ignore, an almost imperceptible tension in his features, as if his soul were struggling to escape from a dark place. Suddenly, his eyes, though closed, moved. It was a quick, erratic movement, as if he were trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake up. Catalina jumped back, covering her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming. Her mind desperately tried to find explanations, nervous reflexes, a final spasm. But why did this feel so different? She stood paralyzed, watching the man. For a moment he seemed completely alive, his brow furrowed with an expression laden with something Catalina couldn't decipher. Pain, fear, guilt, and then everything ceased. His face returned to its previous inert and pale state, as if nothing had happened. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, feeling panic rising. Was he dead? or not. Catalina felt an inexplicable urge to try something, anything, to check his vital signs, shake him, scream for help. But part of her hesitated, as if she feared what she might discover. Who was this man? Why did he seem to be caught between life and death? Catalina's heart felt like it was about to burst out of her chest as she pressed the emergency button on the wall. "Please, someone come quickly!" Her voice came out shaky, almost a cry muffled by the empty vastness of the hallway. Minutes later, 2 doctors and a nurse came running, still adjusting their gowns. Catalina, her face pale and her hands trembling, pointed to the man on the stretcher. He was dead, but she had heard something, and his eyes had moved. The doctors looked at each other skeptically. "It's common for reflexes to occur after death," one of them said, but they began to examine the man anyway. Catalina watched as they performed quick checks. It was then that the unexpected happened. "My God," the doctor muttered, stopping and looked at his colleagues in disbelief. "He has a pulse. It's weak, but he's alive. That's not possible. How can someone come back from the dead like that?" "There must be some mistake," replied the other, frowning as he adjusted his stethoscope. He firmly held the man's pulse, checked his vital signs once more, and finally came to the same impossible conclusion. Catalina felt tears fill her eyes. An inexplicable relief washed over her, but it was soon replaced by deep concern. How could someone presumed dead still be breathing, even if only weakly? As they transferred the man to the emergency room, Catalina noticed something strange hanging from his shirt. There was a small pocket watch, old and worn, that seemed out of place in the hospital environment. She picked it up carefully, wiping the fogged glass. On the back, a delicate inscription caught her attention. "To my beloved Juliana, Juliana," she whispered. The atmosphere in the emergency room was tense. Machines beeped, and the muffled voices of doctors echoed as they raced against time to stabilize the man. Catalina watched from the doorway with a heavy heart, feeling a mixture of hope and fear. He seemed fragile, closer to death than to life, and yet there was something about him that made her believe that his story could not end there. Catalina left, but she couldn't sleep all night. She remained in shock, thinking about the man for hours. The next day, the news arrived. He had survived, but his condition was delicate. Catalina breathed a sigh of relief, but she knew that this was only the first battle. Something inside her told her that the worst was yet to come. Shortly after, while arranging the sheets in the room where he had been placed, Catalina heard a low, hoarse sound coming from the bed. It was irregular breathing, and then, to her surprise, the man's eyes began to open slowly. She approached him, trying to hide her anxiety. "You're awake," she said softly, as if speaking so as not to break something fragile. He blinked in confusion, and his eyes searched the room as if trying to anchor themselves to some reality he couldn't remember. Finally, his gaze met Catalina's, and at that moment, she saw something that puzzled her. It was as if he was looking at her with a mixture of despair and relief, as if she were the only thing he recognized in a world that had disappeared for him. "Where am I?" His voice was weak, almost a whisper, laden with a vulnerability that broke Catalina's heart. "You're in the hospital," she replied, instinctively taking his hand. "They found you in serious condition. Do you remember what happened?" The man shook his head, and his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I don't know who I am. Who are you? Why am I here?" Catalina felt a lump in her throat. He didn't know his own name. He didn't know how he had gotten there. He didn't know why he was fighting to survive. Everything about him seemed broken, like a blank page that had lost its entire history before it could be written. As much as she wanted to give him answers, she had none. But in that moment, she decided she would do everything she could to help him find the pieces he was missing. "Everything will be okay," she promised, even though she didn't know if that was true. As he held her hand tightly, as if she were the only anchor keeping him connected to reality, Catalina watched the man in the bed, wrapped in silence. He barely moved, his gaze lost in some distant point, as if searching for something he knew was beyond his reach. The rhythmic sound of the machines around him seemed to be the only link keeping him in the present. Juliana called him softly, trying the name he had read on the pocket watch, hoping that would provoke some reaction, but he did not respond. He only closed his eyes for a moment, as if the name brought an invisible weight he could not bear. "Do you feel anything when you hear that name?" Catalina tried again, her voice full of caution. He shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with something she could not name: emptiness, pain, or perhaps both. "I don't know who I am," he murmured in a hoarse voice, almost a whisper. "But inside here," he brought his hand to his chest, "I feel like I've lost something I'll never get back." Those words hit Catalina like a bucket of cold water. Juliana's face seemed calm, but his eyes told a different story, a story that even oblivion had not been able to erase. There was a sadness there, deep and suffocating, like a dark sea threatening to swallow everything. Catalina felt a lump in her throat and sat down next to him. "I know it must be terrifying not to remember anything, but sometimes the answers come from where we least expect them," she said, trying to sound confident, although she knew how fragile her words were. "Why would anyone feel that way, even without remembering anything?" he asked, turning his face toward her. Catalina hesitated. How could she answer such a painful question? How could she explain that sometimes the soul bears scars that even oblivion cannot erase? She just squeezed his hand, hoping that simple gesture would convey the comfort that words could not offer at that moment. She realized that the mystery of who Juliana was went far beyond his lost identity. The sadness he carried seemed as old as his very existence, as if it were an echo of something devastating. And somehow Catalina felt that this pain was not only his. In some way, she understood it as he returned to lose himself in silence. Catalina meant a decision. She would not only help Juliana discover who he was, but also what his sadness meant. And maybe, just maybe, by helping him, she would also find answers for the ghosts she carried. While Juliana slept, his irregular breathing echoed in the silent room. Catalina stood by the bed for a moment, watching him. Every expression on his face seemed to be laden with something he could not remember, but that still haunted him. She couldn't shake the feeling that this man was much more than just a stranger with no memory. Determined to find answers, she went to the few belongings he had. There were no documents, no wallet, no obvious clues to his identity, only the pocket watch she had already seen, and a small piece of paper folded and hidden in the inside pocket of his shirt. Catalina carefully opened the paper, revealing a photo war-worn by time. The image showed a woman with a radiant look, carrying a baby in her arms. Both were smiling, the kind of smile that seemed to reflect pure and unconditional love. For a moment, Catalina felt a lump in her throat. That scene, so simple and yet so full of life, contrasted cruelly with Juliana's condition. Now he was lost, and unable to remember who those people were. "Who are they?" she whispered to herself, running her fingers delicately over the image. Was the woman his wife? Was the baby his son? Why had he kept that photo so carefully? And more importantly, where were they now? Catalina turned her gaze to Juliana, who moved slightly in bed, as if he were dreaming. A thought crossed her mind. Could the reason for his pain, for that sadness that seemed to never leave him, be related to those two people? The photo seemed to scream stories that Catalina still couldn't hear, but at that moment, something became clear. Whoever that woman and that baby were, they were important, very important. Putting the photo away again with the same care, Catalina decided she would not sit idly by. She needed to find a connection between this man with no memory and the people in the picture. Perhaps by discovering who they were, she could give Juliana back a part of himself, or at least the truth about what he had lost. The photo seemed to beat in her mind, like an insistent flame illuminating questions she didn't know how to answer. Who was Juliana? What had happened to make him end up there with no memory, carrying such deep sadness? More than curiosity, she felt a weight, almost a responsibility. Something inside her told her that he needed help, and that perhaps she was the only person willing to give it to him. Determined to start somewhere, Catalina went to the hospital reception desk. The nurse on duty, who looked as exhausted as Catalina, greeted her with a bored expression. "I need information about the emergency patient, the man without identification," Catalina began, trying to sound confident. The nurse raised her eyebrows. "Which patient? The man who was pronounced dead, but then we discovered was alive," she explained, feeling the strangeness of her own words. After a few minutes of checking papers and records in the system, the nurse shook her head in confusion. "There's nothing here? No admission record? No name? No companion? It's as if he didn't exist," Catalina frowned. "That doesn't make sense. He's in the hospital. Someone must have brought him in." "If they brought him in, he didn't go through reception," replied the nurse with a shrug. Catalina felt a chill run down her spine. How could someone just show up in a hospital between life and death without anyone knowing where they came from? She remembered the pocket watch with the delicate inscription and the hidden photo. The pieces didn't fit together, and the more she tried to understand, the more everything seemed to slip through her fingers. "This is impossible," she muttered to herself as she walked back to Juliana's room. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere, like an enigma left at the hospital door for her to solve. When she entered the room, she found Juliana awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He seemed more vulnerable than ever, a figure lost among the shadows of who he was and the emptiness of who he was now. "I looked for answers," Catalina said, sitting down next to him, "but no one knows how you got here." He turned his face toward her, his eyes filled with tears. "Maybe I shouldn't be here," he replied, his voice broken, laden with a sorrow that made Catalina's heart shrink. "I insist," she said, taking his hand. "You're here for a reason. We're going to find out what happened, who you are." Although she didn't know how, Catalina promised herself that she would find answers. The days in the hospital passed slowly, each hour laden with a tension that Catalina couldn't ignore. Juliana, now a little stronger physically, seemed to be fighting a battle, promised herself she would find answers. The days in the hospital passed slowly, each hour filled with a tension that Catalina could not ignore. Juliana, now a little stronger physically, seemed to be fighting a much bigger battle inside himself. Sometimes he would remain silent for long periods, his gaze lost in something only he could see. Other times, his breathing would quicken, and beads of sweat ran down his forehead as if he were fleeing from memories that refused to go away. Catalina called him one morning, her voice trembling like a string about to snap. She approached him and took his hand. "What's wrong, Juliana? Did you remember something?" He closed his eyes as if the simple act of remembering were a painful effort. "There's a house," he murmured, "with blue windows and laughter, children's laughter." Catalina felt her heart tighten. It was the first time Juliana had mentioned anything specific about his past, but the tone of his voice held no joy. He was afraid, mixed with a sadness so deep it seemed to drown him. "What else do you see?" she asked, trying to guide him gently. Juliana took a deep breath, squeezing his eyes shut, as if trying to pull the memories out of a dark place. "Music," he said. "I think there was music," and then silence. His voice broke on the last word, and he held his head in his hands. But when he tried to remember, it hurt. It hurt a lot. Catalina put a hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him. "It's okay, Juliana. You don't need to force yourself. The memories will come at the right time." But inside, she knew that time was not the only enemy. The house with blue windows, the children's laughter, the music, and the silence. Everything. It seemed like an incomplete puzzle, but each piece he mentioned carried a devastating emotional charge. Catalina said after a long silence, in a voice that was almost inaudible, Julian whispered, "What if what I remember is worse than not remembering anything at all?" She didn't know how to respond. Juliana was right to be afraid. Sometimes the past could be as cruel as oblivion, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw that the only thing worse than remembering was continuing to live without answers. The image of a house with blue windows and children's laughter was now also etched in Catalina's mind, and although it brought hope that they might discover more about Juliana, she feared that the truth they sought would be impossible to bear. Catalina held the carefully folded photo as she walked through the narrow streets of Dallas near the hospital. The image of the woman holding the baby would not leave her mind. Every detail, the sparkle in the woman's eyes, the child's innocent smile seemed to whisper secrets she could not understand. Dallas was simple, with modest houses and unkempt gardens, but there was a sense of history there, as if every corner held memories of entire lives. Catalina looked around, searching for a familiar face or some sign that could connect that photo to Juliana's past. Stopping at a small grocery store, she showed the photo to the owner, an elderly man. He looked at it carefully but shook his head. "Never seen these people, miss," he replied, with a tone of regret, in Lavos. Catalina continued asking from door to door, but no one seemed to recognize the faces in the photo. Discouragement began to grow inside her, but something, perhaps the weight of the silent promise she had made to Juliana, prevented her from giving up. Finally, as she turned a corner, she saw an elderly woman sitting in a rocking chair, her wrinkled hands knitting slowly. Catalina approached with some hesitation and showed her the photo. "I've seen these people before," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The old woman stopped knitting and adjusted her glasses. Her eyes narrowed as she examined the photo, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then she murmured something that made Catalina's heart race. "I've seen this man. What was his name?" "I think he was involved in that case of the woman and child in the accident." "I don't think his name was Juliana," said the old woman, her voice laden with something Catalina couldn't quite decipher. Sadness, nostalgia, but he and his family left years ago. Catalina felt a chill. The name she had barely guessed from the pocket watch finally had real weight. "Did you know him?" she asked quickly, trying to contain her anxiety. The old woman nodded slowly. "Not personally. I saw him in the newspaper, and people talked about him. He was a musician, I think, but something happened later. We never saw them again." "Did we ever see them again?" "Something happened," Catalina insisted, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. "What happened to him?" The old woman looked at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to speak. Finally, with a sigh, she said, "I don't know, my child." Catalina returned to the hospital with more questions than answers. Juliana was not just a man without memory. He was someone who had been known, loved, and who had disappeared without a trace. But why? And what had happened to his family? As she walked through the silent corridors of the hospital, holding the photo even more carefully, she knew that Juliana's story was far from being an ordinary mystery. Something deep and painful had taken him away from his life, and now Catalina felt that somehow she was destined to help him face that pain. Even if it took her to dark places she had never imagined, Catalina couldn't get the old woman's words out of her mind. Juliana. He had a name, a past. With each new piece of the puzzle, she felt she was getting closer to something, but also that the answers would bring more pain than relief. Determined to find out more, she returned to Dallas, looking for any clues that would reveal who Juliana was before everything fell apart. In the small central plaza, she found a group of neighbors chatting. She showed them the photo once more and mentioned the name that now seemed so familiar to her. A middle-aged man who was tuning an old guitar looked up curiously. Juliana asked, her voice full of surprise, "Are you talking about Juliana?" The musician, Catalina, sat down next to him, feeling her heart beating fast. "Yes, you knew him. I knew him. He was good with the guitar," replied the man, his gaze lost in his memories. "He had a gift for music. He played the guitar in a way that made the soul vibrate." Catalina felt a warmth in her chest, as if she were discovering a version of Juliana that even he himself did not know. But then the man sighed deeply, changing the tone of his voice. "But that was before the accident." "What a pity," said Catalina anxiously, feeling the weight of that word floating in the air. The man looked down, as if reliving that story was painful even for him. "I don't know for sure, but they said he was with his family. A car crossed in front of them. It was horrible. Some say he survived, but lost everything. His wife, his son. But there are people who believe he also died. Others say he simply disappeared because he couldn't deal with the guilt, and he wasn't even in the accident. What is certain is that something happened because of that accident." Catalina felt a lump form in her throat. The weight of the man's words was almost unbearable. That was the reason for the sadness Juliana carried. He had lost everything, and no one ever heard from him again. Asked, her voice almost breaking. The man shook his head. It wasn't as if he had vanished into thin air. Those who knew him still mourn him to this day. He was special. As she returned to the hospital, the words echoed in Catalina's mind. An accident, the loss of his family, the guilt that made him disappear. She looked again at the photo in her hands. That woman and that baby, smiling with so much love, were now just shadows in Juliana's past. When she entered the room, she found Juliana sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his trembling hands. He seemed lost, as if trapped between the present and a past he could not reach. Catalina approached slowly, sitting down beside him. Juliana began in a soft voice, but one laden with emotion. "I discovered something about you." He looked up at her, and the moment their eyes met, Catalina saw something that looked like despair and a slight flash of fear. "What did you find out?" she asked in a faltering voice. Catalina took a deep breath. "They talked about an accident, a car accident. They said you were with your family, your wife and your son, and that they didn't survive." Juliana's eyes widened, his breathing became irregular, and he brought his hands to his head as if trying to block out the words. "I don't remember that. Who were they?" he said, his voice trembling, but it makes sense. It's like I feel this pain, this guilt, as if I knew I did something terrible, even though I don't know what it was." Catalina placed a hand on his, trying to offer comfort. "That doesn't mean it was your fault, Juliana. You suffered too. You lost everything." He shook his head vigorously, tears streaming down his face. "But why? Why me? Why don't I remember them? Why am I alive and they're not? It's not fair. It's not—" He stopped. The words faded into a heavy sob. Catalina felt her own eyes fill with tears. "You're alive because you still have something to do here, Juliana. Maybe you can't change what happened, but you can find a way to move forward, to honor them. They wouldn't want to see you like this." He looked at her, pain overflowing in his eyes. "I feel like I'm carrying a debt I can never repay. Catalina, how can I live with this?" Catalina squeezed his hand tighter. "Start here now with the truth. We're going to discover together who you are, what happened, and how you can forgive yourself. You don't have to carry this alone." Juliana closed his eyes, letting more tears fall. For the first time, he allowed someone to share the weight of his pain. The night in the hospital was so quiet that every sound seemed amplified. Catalina sat in a chair next to Juliana, the dim lights of the monitor illuminating the room with a pale blue hue. He had finally fallen asleep, but even at rest, his face looked tense, as if he were carrying the weight of a world he couldn't remember. Catalina closed her eyes for a moment, exhausted, but was awakened by a sound that made her shudder. It was a low, hoarse moan that soon turned into incomprehensible words. When she opened her eyes, she saw Juliana tossing and turning in bed, his face contorted with agony. "No, no," he murmured, his voice filled with panic. Suddenly, his hands grabbed the sheets so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Catalina quickly approached and took his arm. Juliana called out to him in a soft but urgent voice, "Wake up, you're dreaming." But he seemed trapped in another place, in another reality. Sophia suddenly screamed, the sound so full of pain that tears filled Catalina's eyes. She repeated his name once more, her voice breaking into a desperate sob. Catalina couldn't help herself. She took his hand tightly, trying to bring him back. "Juliana, it's me, Catalina. I'm here. You're safe." He suddenly opened his eyes, his gaze confused and filled with tears. For a moment, it seemed as if he was still lost in his nightmare, but then he recognized Catalina and began to cry, sobbing like a child. I saw her, he murmured in a choked voice. "She was there. Sophia, I lost her. Catalina pressed her hand against his chest, trying to calm him down. "It was a dream, Juliana. A painful dream, but just that. Now you're not alone. I'm here with you." He continued to cry, and Catalina felt her heart tighten. Every tear that fell down Juliana's face seemed to carry the pain of someone who had lost more than she could bear. She knew that this nightmare was more than a fragment of memory. It was the open wound he carried in his soul, a pain she could not yet fully comprehend. "I promise we will find out what happened," she whispered, her voice broken with emotion. "I promise I will help you remember, and when you are ready, I will help you find peace, Juliana. For her, for Sophia." He just nodded, still trapped by his tears. At that moment, Catalina knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also understood that she would do everything possible to keep her promise because, As she held Juliana's hand that night, she understood that she was not only helping him face his pain, but also facing her own. Dawn brought an air of determination to Catalina. After the tumultuous night, she felt she could not wait any longer. The pieces of Juliana's past were so close, but still hidden in the shadows. Determined, she took the photo and the pocket watch and boarded a bus bound for the place she had found among the clues to where Juliana lived. The road was long, winding through mountains and valleys, while the sky oscillated between shades of gray and gold. Catalina looked out the window, holding the objects tightly. A growing anxiety mixed with a sense of duty weighed on her chest. Who were Sophia and Lucas, and what had Juliana lost in that place? When the bus finally stopped, Catalina got off and was greeted by a silent village, almost forgotten by time. The cobbled streets were empty, and the houses with their simple, worn facades exuded stories of years gone by. She walked slowly, each step echoing in the silence. It was then that she saw the church. It was small, with white walls stained by time and a bell tower that seemed to watch over the village. Something drew her there, as if an invisible force were guiding her. Upon entering the churchyard, her eyes immediately fell on a plaque placed on one of the walls. She approached with her heart racing and read the words engraved in simple letters, but full of emotion. Sophia and Lucas, always in our hearts. Juliana's name was not there, but Catalina knew immediately that the inscription belonged to him. The pain she had seen in his eyes, the tears he had shed the night before, everything made sense now. Sophia and Lucas, the woman and baby in the photo, were not just memories. She fell to her knees in front of the plaque, feeling an overwhelming weight in her chest. Silent tears rolled down her face as she tried to imagine the depth of Juliana's pain, losing his wife, losing his son, losing everything. But at the same time, a new question arose. What really happened in that town? Was it an accident, as everyone said, or was there something else behind that tragedy? As she raised her eyes to the sky, Catalina felt she was closer to the truth, but she was also closer to the pain that Juliana feared to face. She knew that when she returned to him, she would not only have to tell him what she had discovered, but also help him carry the weight of that past, and perhaps help him find a way to move forward. The dim light of dusk illuminated the hospital room, painting soft shadows on the white walls. Juliana was sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the window. Although he wasn't really seeing the world outside, he seemed distant, lost, among the fragments of a past he still couldn't reach. Catalina entered the room, slowly, holding a tray with tea from her trip to the village. The silence between them seemed even heavier. She hadn't told him what she had discovered. Something in her hesitated, perhaps fearing that he was not ready to hear it, or worse, that the truth would be too devastating for him. Suddenly, she broke the silence. Her voice was low, but charged with something she could not identify. He turned to her, his deep eyes full of questions. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Catalina paused, surprised by the intensity of his question. "What do you mean?" she replied, trying to buy time to gather her own thoughts. "I'm a stranger," Juliana continued, gesturing with his hands. "I don't even know who I really am. I don't know what I did. I don't know if I'm someone who deserves this help. But you're here every day helping me. Why?" His words struck her deeply, causing her heart to race. She placed the tray on the table next to the bed and sat down next to her, feeling the weight of everything he had been keeping inside. Juliana began, his voice trembling. "I've never told anyone here this, but I had a sister." He looked up at her, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "She was a few years younger than me," Catalina continued, looking at the floor as if reviewing buried memories. She had a smile that lit up any room, but inside she was always struggling with depression. That's what the doctors said. She never wanted anyone to know how much she was suffering. She always pretended she was fine. Catalina's voice faltered, and she needed a moment to continue. "I knew. Juliana knew she was unwell, but I never knew what to do. I always thought I had time to help her, to say the right thing, but one day, it was too late." Juliana fell silent, his eyes fixed on Catalina's face. She looked up, tears threatening to fall, falling. I couldn't save her, she confessed, her voice breaking, and that haunts me every day. But with you, you gave me a chance to do something different, to help someone before it's too late. Maybe it's selfish, but I feel that if I can help you in some way, I'm also saving her. Juliana swallowed, feeling the pain in her words as if it were his own. He said nothing for a moment, but then he placed a hand on hers, Catalina, squeezing it gently. You didn't save your sister, Catalina finally said, her voice low and heavy with emotion. But you're saving me, and that's something I can never thank you enough for. Those words hung in the air, filled with a sincerity that finally brought tears to Catalina's face. At that moment, something changed between the two of them. They were no longer just a nurse and her patient. They were two broken souls trying to find a way to heal together. Catalina felt the puzzle beginning to take shape, but each new piece seemed heavier than the last. Carefully, she began to piece together the stories she had heard and the fragmented memories that Juliana shared. He had mentioned a house with blue windows and the sound of children's laughter, something that at first glance sounded hopeful, but was always shrouded in a shadow of loss. Catalina searched the hospital archives, hoping to find something that would confirm her suspicions. Hours passed, until she finally found what she was looking for, an old police report related to a car accident. The names recorded in the report left her frozen. Sofia Jimenez, 28 years old. Lucas Jimenez, 4 years old. Catalina's heart raced as she read every detail. Although the words seemed to cut her soul, the date of the accident coincided with Juliana's disappearance. From the village, the words were impersonal, cold, describing how a vehicle had unexpectedly crossed the road, causing a fatal collision. Sofia and Lucas did not survive, but there was no mention of Juliana. He was not listed among the dead or in the accident. So he was there or not, Catalina whispered to herself as silent tears ran down her face. She saw everything. She returned to Juliana's room with the weight of the discovery pounding inside her. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes fixed on the window as if trying to find answers in the outside world. When she entered, he turned slowly, his face laden with a melancholy that seemed never to leave him. Juliana began by sitting down next to her, his voice broken, but he knew he needed to listen. I found out something about Sofia and Lucas. Upon hearing the names, Juliana's eyes widened, and she brought a hand to her chest, as if something invisible had struck him hard. Catalina nodded, taking his hand. Sofia, your wife, was 28 years old. Juliana and Lucas, your son, was 4 years old. He closed his eyes, and for a moment Catalina thought he wasn't going to react. But then, a deep sob escaped his throat, followed by another. Tears flowed uncontrollably as he covered his face with his hands, as if trying to ward off the images that were beginning to return. I remember, he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. They were laughing. I was so happy, and then I couldn't save them. Catalina squeezed his hand tighter. You suffered too, Juliana, and no one can judge how you dealt with it. But now it's time to face that past. You're not alone anymore. He looked at her with red, tear-filled eyes, but for the first time, there was something else besides the pain. There was a glimmer of acceptance, a spark of willingness to face the darkness. Catalina knew the road would be difficult, but she also knew that this moment was a crucial step. Guilt had become Juliana's inseparable shadow, and as he relived the painful fragments of his past, the story Catalina had discovered took shape. After the accident, Juliana didn't have the strength to stay. He watched Sofia and Lucas's funeral from afar, hidden among the trees, unable to approach. The few neighbors who attended the ceremony, filled with grief, assumed that he had not survived the accident, or that he was the culprit and had fled. Juliana, in his pain and shame, did not correct them. He could not face them, he confessed to Catalina in a weak voice as he looked at the ground. Every time he looked at someone, he saw judgment in their eyes. But the worst, was looking at myself. I let them die, Catalina, and since that day, it's as if I too have died. Catalina felt tears welling up, but she didn't let them fall. She knew that Juliana didn't need her sadness, but her strength. She placed a hand on his trembling one. It wasn't your fault, and you didn't die, Juliana, she said firmly. You survived, and that wasn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to remember them, to honor them, and perhaps to forgive yourself. He shook his head as tears fell freely down his face. I don't know how. I don't know if I can. Catalina squeezed his hand, seeking to convey courage through contact. Then let's start where it all began. The house with the blue windows. They say they can discharge you now. They're just finishing up confirming your documents to make sure you're Juliana Jimenez. Juliana looked up, distant and frightened. I remember the house, but what are we going to find there? I don't know if I can. You can, Catalina interrupted him with more conviction than I felt. I'll be by your side. It may be difficult. It may hurt more than anything you've ever felt before, but it's the only way. Juliana, you need to face it, not for them, but for yourself. The idea seemed terrible to him, but at the same time inevitable. Catalina saw something change in his eyes, a glimmer of determination, albeit fragile. A few days later, they left for the village, the same place where Catalina had found the church with the memorial to Sophia and Lucas. The trip was almost silent, but the weight of what they were about to do hung between them like a dark cloud. When they arrived, it was easy to find the house. When the car stopped in front of it, Juliana remained silent, staring at the building in front of him. It was as if time had stopped, but at the same time, it had taken away everything he knew. The blue windows, so vibrant in his memories, were now faded, marked by the years that had passed without him. Every detail seemed familiar, and at the same time strange, like a distant memory coming back to him like a blow to the chest. Catalina got out of the car first, waiting for him to follow her. When she finally opened the door and set foot on the ground, Juliana seemed to carry the weight of an entire century on his shoulders. He took a few hesitant steps toward the entrance, holding the gate. His hands trembled as he lifted it to touch it. The gate, now rusty and creaking with the slightest movement, seemed to resist, as if it held the ghosts of the past that Juliana had left behind. It's the same, he murmured, almost to himself. Exactly the same. Catalina approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. You can do it, Juliana. Just take one step at a time. With a trembling sigh, he pushed the gate and entered. Each step toward the house was like crossing an invisible barrier, one he feared to face, but he knew he had to. As they approached the door, the current resident, an elderly man, greeted them with a look of surprise and compassion. He seemed to know who Juliana was before he said a word. You're back. Come in, the man said simply, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Without further questions, he let them into the house. Juliana stopped in the hallway, his gaze fixed on the floor. His feet felt heavy, but he forced them forward, guided by something even he couldn't explain. When the man opened a door at the end of the hallway, Juliana stopped at the entrance, unable to cross it immediately. What is this? He asked, his voice almost inaudible. I kept what I could, replied the man in a kind tone. I thought you might come back one day. Juliana took a step inside, followed by Catalina. It was a small room, but full of memories. Old toys were scattered around, covered in dust, as if waiting for hands that would never touch them again. In the corner, a small children's guitar rested against the wall, its strings loose and worn. Next to the guitar, a pile of papers caught his attention. Juliana approached with tears in his eyes and picked up the first paper. It was a musical score with hasty and incomplete notes. He ran his fingers over the notes as if trying to remember the melody that had once begun there. I wrote this, he whispered, as the tears fell freely. Now it was for them, for Sophia and Lucas, but I never finished it. Catalina watched him closely and felt her heart tighten. Seeing the pain reflected in Juliana's eyes, she held one of the scores so carefully that she seemed afraid it would fall apart in her hands. Maybe you can still finish it, she said softly. Juliana looked at her with eyes full of mixed emotions, sadness, regret, but also what seemed to be a small spark of hope. He knew that to finish those songs, he would have to face every bit of pain that the notes carried. But for the first time, he considered the possibility that music could be a way to remember, to honor, and perhaps to begin to heal. That room with its dusty toys and forgotten sheet music was not just a space filled with old things. It was a sanctuary of memories, a place where Juliana would have to confront the past and decide what to do with it. He knelt in front of the guitar, as if he were facing something much greater than himself. With trembling hands, he picked it up, running his fingers over the loose, rusty strings. Catalina remained silent, watching him closely. She could feel the tension in the air, the internal struggle Juliana was facing as he held that piece of his past. There was pain on his face, but also something else, a trace of who he used to be before everything was taken from him. "I used to play for them," he murmured in a low voice, heavy with emotion. "Lucas loved music. He always laughed when I started playing." Sophia paused, swallowing hard as tears began to well up in her eyes. "She used to say that my music was like a piece of our soul." Catalina took a step forward, but stopped, afraid of interrupting that fragile moment. Juliana took a deep breath, placed the guitar on his lap, and tried to tune the strings. Although they were no longer in tune, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember the melody he had once created. Then he began to play. The first notes were hesitant, almost painful in their imperfection, but filled with such pure emotion that Catalina felt a lump form in her throat. It was a simple melody, full of sweetness and melancholy. But before he could continue, Juliana stopped. His hands were shaking so much that he dropped the guitar to the floor, and the sound of the strings resonated through the room like a lament. He covered his face with his hands, his breathing rapid as tears began to flow. "I can't," he said, his voice broken. "I can't remember the rest. I can't finish." Catalina knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Juliana began, trying to keep his voice steady, even though he also felt tears were about to fall. "You don't need to finish now. It's too much pain, too many things to face at once." He shook his head, his shoulders shaking as the crying overwhelmed him. Every note, every chord. "Everything reminds me of what I lost. It's like opening a wound that never heals." Catalina squeezed his shoulder harder, her voice now a soft whisper. "But perhaps, Juliana, it is through this music that you will find a way to heal. You don't have to do it alone. I am here with you. We will find a way to finish this song together." He looked up at her with red, pain-filled eyes. For a moment, it seemed as if he wanted to give up, but then something changed. It was small, almost imperceptible, a spark of determination. Catalina knew the road would be long, but that instant, that small moment of hope, was the first step for Juliana to face his memories without being consumed by them. Catalina, still surrounded by the heavy silence that enveloped her and Juliana, began to search through an old wooden box leaning in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she took out the objects, as if each one carried a piece of a story that was not hers, but now felt her own. Faded photographs, children's toys, and carefully folded letters appeared among yellowed papers. Catalina hesitated as she picked up a notebook with a faded blue cover and edges worn by time. When she opened it, she saw the delicate handwriting and recognized that the diary belonged to Sophia. "It's hers," she murmured, as if talking to herself. Juliana, sitting near the guitar, looked up but said nothing. He seemed trapped in a silence filled with emotions he couldn't express. Catalina slowly turned the pages, her eyes capturing fragments that revealed Sophia's deepest thoughts and feelings. With each line, the image of the radiant woman she had seen in the photo came to life, but also brought more pain. Sophia wrote about her love for Juliana, about the joys and challenges of building a family, and especially about the pride she felt when she saw him play his songs for Lucas. Then, in the middle of the pages, Catalina found a loose sheet of paper, carefully folded. It was a letter. When she opened it, she saw Juliana's name written at the top and read the words that seemed to whisper directly to her soul. "Juliana, I forgive you, but please don't lose yourself." Catalina felt tears welling up before she had finished reading the letter. It wasn't long, but each word seemed to weigh more than she could bear. "I know that sometimes you feel like you're failing, but I want you to know that's not true. You're a wonderful man, the father Lucas always dreamed of having. I know music is your passion, but never let it become a barrier between us. Juliana, I love you. I forgive you for everything, but please promise me that no matter what happens, you won't lose sight of who you are." Catalina pressed the paper against her chest, feeling the depth of the love that Sophia still had for Juliana. Even in the most difficult moments, when she looked at him, she saw that he was watching her with eyes full of tears, as if he knew she had found something important. "What is it?" he asked with a trembling voice. Catalina knelt beside him, placing the letter in his hands. "It's from Sophia. It's for you." He hesitated, but began to read. As he progressed through his wife's words, sobs overwhelmed him. "Juliana." He put his hand on his chest as if trying to contain a heart that seemed about to burst. "She forgave me," he murmured, as the tears fell freely. "But I have never forgiven myself." Catalina held his hands firmly. "Maybe it's time to try, Juliana." She knew the man you were, and more than that, she believed in the man you could be. You don't have to hide anymore. He looked at her with eyes full of a mixture of pain and hope. The letter trembled in his hands, but it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a reminder of the love Sophia felt for him, an anchor for what he needed to find within himself. Juliana held the letter with trembling hands, his fingers clutching the paper as if afraid it would disappear. The silence in the room was broken only by his heavy breathing as his eyes scanned the words written by Sophia, words that seemed to open deep wounds but also offered a glimmer of something she had long forgotten. Catalina watched him closely, sitting next to him, feeling every emotion that welled up in him as if it were her own. Finally, Juliana took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears, and began to read the letter aloud. Juliana's sobs grew louder, but he continued with a trembling voice. Catalina felt a lump in her throat, as tears fell uncontrollably. "I never wanted you to give up on your dream, Juliana. I just wanted you to understand that you don't have to be perfect to be loved. We love you just the way you are. Don't lose yourself. We will always be with you." When he finished reading, Juliana dropped the letter into his lap and buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with the intensity of his crying. Heartbroken, Catalina wrapped him in an embrace, holding him as if trying to protect him from the pain that consumed him. "She forgave me," he whispered between sobs, "but I disappointed them. I spent so much time traveling, trying to make my music work, that I didn't have enough time for them, and when I finally came back, I lost them." "Juliana," Catalina said, her voice soft but firm, "Sophia didn't want you to live trapped in that. Music was part of who you were, but she believed in you as a father, as a husband, as a man. She knew you loved your family." He raised his face, his eyes red and filled with tears. "And if I never managed to forgive myself," Catalina took his hands and squeezed them tightly. "You can start by remembering not only the pain, but also the love. Every note you played, every smile from Lucas, every moment that Sophia kept in her heart. All of that is still alive inside you. That's what you need to carry with you, Juliana. Not the guilt, but the love." Her words seemed to echo in the silence of the room, and for a moment Juliana closed his eyes, letting the weight of the letter and the memories flood over him. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt that perhaps it would be possible to remember without being consumed by pain, and maybe use those memories to start finding himself again. The sun had barely risen when Catalina woke up, still feeling the weight of the previous day on her chest. The words from Sophia's letter wouldn't leave her mind, and Juliana's sobs echoed like a reminder of how much she needed. He needed help to find his way back to himself. Determined to do something more, Catalina decided to look for answers beyond what she already knew. During a conversation with the old man who now lived in Juliana's former home, she heard a detail that caught her attention. "Juliana used to go to the orphanage every week," said the man with a melancholy smile. "He played for the children. It was as if every note that came out of his guitar transformed their day. Many of them had nothing, but with his music, it seemed as if they had the world." Catalina felt a warmth in her heart. As much as Juliana carried the guilt of not having been there enough for his own family, it was clear that he had left a deep mark on other lives. Perhaps, she thought, that could be the key to helping him rediscover his purpose and himself. She found him sitting, looking up at the sky. He seemed calmer, but still enveloped in a sadness that Catalina was beginning to understand that he did not easily forget. Juliana began by sitting down next to her. He looked at her, and she noticed that there was something different in his eyes, perhaps a small but present spark of hope. "What's going on?" he asked in a softer voice than usual. Catalina took a deep breath before answering. "I discovered that you used to play for children in an orphanage. They eagerly awaited your music. You made a difference in their lives." Juliana frowned his brow, as if trying to remember. "I think I remember," he said, after a long silence. "It was a small place, but full of joy. The children always asked me to play the same songs. They laughed and sang. It was the only place where I felt truly needed." Catalina smiled, moved. "Maybe you're still needed there. Why don't we visit the orphanage? Maybe those children still remember you. And who knows? That could help you remember who you were before all this." Juliana looked at her doubtfully. "What if they don't recognize me? What if I'm not that man anymore?" Catalina took his hand and squeezed it firmly. "They don't need the man you were. They need who you are now. Even if you're still rebuilding yourself, and maybe helping those children can help you find a purpose again." Sophia knew it, Juliana. That's why she believed in you. He looked away toward the horizon, reflecting on Catalina's words. Deep down, he knew she was right, but the idea of facing the place where he once felt complete also terrified him. Still, after a long silence, he nodded slightly. "Let's go," he said in a low but firm voice. "Let's go to the orphanage." The orphanage was on a hill surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the wind. Juliana hesitated for a moment at the entrance, looking at the simple but welcoming building that seemed full of stories and laughter. Catalina touched his arm, encouraging him to take the first step inside. The walls were covered with colorful drawings made by children, and the distant sound of laughter echoed in the hallways. A feeling of familiarity washed over Juliana, as if a forgotten part of his soul was trying to awaken. They were greeted by a smiling employee who led them to the main hall. As soon as Juliana entered, the curious eyes of several children turned toward him. Some returned to playing, but a little girl with tight braids and big, bright eyes walked toward him. "Hello," she said, holding something in her hands. It was an old vinyl record with a slightly worn cover. Her little fingers held the object so carefully that it looked like a treasure. "Can you play it for me?" Juliana was surprised, looking at the girl with curiosity. "What is this?" he asked, his voice soft but full of emotion. "My grandmother said these are magical songs," the girl replied with a shy smile. "She gave it to me before she left, but I've never listened to it. She said only someone special could play it." Juliana swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. He looked at the record, and for the first time in a long time, he felt his hands yearning for a guitar. Something in that moment seemed bigger than him, as if it were a calling he couldn't ignore. Catalina, who was watching the interaction closely, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Try it, Juliana, just try it." He bent down to the girl's height and smiled shyly. "I can try, Luce," he said, noticing for the first time the name embroidered on her little t-shirt. "But you'll have to sing with me." "Okay." Luce smiled broadly, full of enthusiasm, and ran to find a stool to sit on. Juliana stood up, feeling the weight of all the memories and pain he carried, but also something new, a spark of purpose. One of the employees brought a borrowed guitar. It was old and out of tune, but when Juliana held it, it seemed as if the instrument had been waiting for him. He took a deep breath, his fingers hesitant on the strings before he began to play the notes. Although simple, they began to fill the room with a sweet and melancholic melody. Luce watched him with shining eyes, moving gently to the rhythm of the music. She began to hum, her childlike voice transforming the moment into something magical. As he played, Juliana felt something change inside him. It wasn't just the music, it was the connection, the joy he saw in Luce's eyes, the way the other children began to join in and sing. Everything seemed to break down an invisible barrier he had built around himself. When he finished, Luce hugged him, clinging tightly to his legs. "You're special," she said with the sincerity that only a child can have. "My grandmother was right." Juliana looked at Catalina, who had tears in her eyes. Luz's hug stayed with Juliana like an invisible mark, warming his heart in a way he hadn't felt in years. As he returned home that night, the girl's words echoed in his mind. "You're special. My grandmother was right." For the first time, he wondered if there was something special about him, something that the pain had not managed to erase completely. The music he had played, though hesitant and incomplete, seemed to have awakened something not only in the children, but within himself. The next day, when Catalina mentioned that the orphanage always needed volunteers, especially someone with musical talent, Juliana did not respond immediately. He remained silent for a long moment, looking at his hands as if trying to imagine what else they could do besides carry his guilt. "Do you think I could teach?" he finally asked in a low voice, almost as if he were afraid to hear the answer. Catalina smiled with a gentleness that made his heart feel less heavy. "I think you could change lives, Juliana, just as you changed Luz's yesterday." His low voice, almost as if he were afraid to hear the answer. Catalina smiled, with a kindness that made his heart feel less heavy. "I think you could change lives, Juliana, just as you changed Luz's yesterday." That was the next day. Juliana returned to the orphanage with Catalina by his side. When he entered the room, the children recognized him immediately, running toward him with laughter and asking him to play again. But this time, he had something else in mind. "Today, I want to teach you to make music with me," he said, trying to hide the doubt in his voice. Luz was the first to raise her hand, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. The employees brought simple instruments, flutes, small drums, and even some children's guitars. Juliana sat with the children in a circle, starting with basic rhythms, clapping his hands and inviting them to follow the beat. Little by little, he began to play a simple rhythm on the guitar, and the children followed him. Laughter filled the room, and Juliana felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: genuine joy. After a few hours, as the children put away the instruments, Luz approached him again. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked with the innocence that only a child could have. Juliana looked at Catalina, who just nodded with an encouraging smile. He bent down to Luz's height and replied with a shy smile, "Yes, I will come back." And he did come back, day after day. Each visit to the orphanage seemed to bring back a piece of himself. He began to teach the children not only to play, but to feel the music, to express their emotions through it. For Juliana, teaching music became more than a way to help others. It was his way to reconnect with the world, with the memories of Sophia and Lucas, and more importantly, with himself. Catalina watched everything closely, her heart filled with pride. She saw how, day after day, Juliana found the strength to face his demons, using music as a thread that guided him back to life. And by helping him, she herself felt her wounds begin to heal, as if Juliana's journey were intertwined with hers in a way she could never have imagined. Later that night, Catalina and Juliana walked under a starry sky. The silence between them was comfortable, but Catalina noticed that something weighed heavily on his expression. There was a melancholy in his eyes that contrasted with the smile she had seen earlier. Juliana broke the silence. "Are you okay?" He stopped and looked at the ground, his hands tucked into his pockets. For a moment, Catalina thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed deeply and spoke, his voice low and broken. "Today was a good day," he began hesitantly. "But no matter how hard I try, I still feel like I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to keep living after what happened." Catalina felt a lump in her throat. She knew those words would come eventually, but hearing the raw pain in his voice was devastating. She took a step forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "Juliana," she began, trying to keep her voice steady, "you've been through a loss that no one should have to go through, but that doesn't mean your life is over. You're here now, and you're making a difference for those children. That's not a burden, it's a gift." He shook his head, tears beginning to roll down his face. "But why me? Why did they leave and I'm still here? If I had been home instead of traveling so much for work with the music, maybe they would still be here. That day, I should have been driving, not..." Sophia Catalina felt tears burning in her own eyes. Juliana, you can't change what happened. Nothing but what you do now is important. You're living, not because of guilt, but because they believed in you. Sophia forgave you. Remember? She wanted you to move on. What happened was an accident. He finally looked up at her, his eyes full of pain. But how can I forgive myself? How can I move on with this burden? Catalina took a deep breath and took both his hands. You don't have to carry this. I'm here with you. And those children, did you see how they look at you? You're teaching them something they never had. Love, purpose, joy. Maybe you'll never completely forgive yourself, but little by little, you can learn to live again, and that's already a start. He nodded slowly, tears still falling, but there was something different in his expression, perhaps a small spark of acceptance, or at least the beginning of it. The day was cloudy, as if even the sky was preparing for the weight of the moment to come. Catalina guided Juliana along the paths of the small cemetery, her hands clasped around a bouquet of white flowers. He walked silently beside her, his gaze fixed on the ground. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the air around him had become denser. When they reached an isolated part of the cemetery, Catalina stopped in front of them. There were 2 simple gravestones side by side with names that Juliana also knew, but still afraid to face. Sofia Jimenez and Lucas Jimenez. When he saw the names engraved in the cold stone, Juliana stopped, unable to move. His breathing became irregular, and his hands began to shake. Catalina watched him with a heavy heart, but she knew she had to give him this moment. I don't know if I can do this, he murmured, his voice broken. Catalina placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You're here now, Juliana. You've already taken the most difficult step. Now you just have to be honest with them and with yourself. He looked at her with tear-filled eyes before taking a hesitant step toward the gravestones. Every detail of the stones seemed to scream at him. The names, the dates, the simple message engraved below, loved forever. When he finally knelt in front of the gravestones, Juliana could no longer hold back. Tears flowed in torrents, his body shaking as he sobbed uncontrollably. I'm so sorry, he managed to say between sobs, his voice almost inaudible. Sophia, Lucas, I'm so sorry. Catalina watched him closely, silent tears falling down her face. The man in front of her, who had carried so much weight in silence for so long, now let the pain overflow, filling the air like a silent cry of despair. I should have been better, Juliana continued, staring at the gravestones with red eyes. I should have spent more time with you. I should have saved them. Catalina knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his back. Juliana, you did the best you could. Sophia knew that. She believed in you, even in the moments when you didn't believe in yourself. He turned to her with a devastated look, but deeply grateful for her presence. But how do I go on with this? How do I live knowing that they can no longer? Catalina took his hands, squeezing them. You live because they believed you could. You live because the love they had for you never died, and never will. It's in every note you play, in every smile you bring to those children in the orphanage. It's in you, Juliana, and that's how you keep them alive. Juliana closed his eyes, tears still falling, but for the first time he felt something different. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was a small opening, a space where perhaps one day the memory of Sophia and Lucas could coexist with the life he still had left to live. He placed the bouquet of flowers between the gravestones and ran his fingers over the inscriptions, as if he wanted to absorb every detail. As the wind blew gently around him, Juliana murmured, I will never forget you, and I will try to live for us. Catalina remained silently by his side, knowing that this moment was only the beginning of a new journey, one in which Juliana would begin to transform his pain into love and his guilt into purpose. Juliana remained kneeling in front of the gravestones, the silence around him filled with the soft sound of the wind and the weight of his own emotions. His hand still rested on Sophia's name, as if he could feel her through the cold stone. Words swirled in his mind, but none seemed sufficient. How could he ask for forgiveness for something that seemed unforgivable? His shoulders slumped, shook, and he closed his eyes tightly, trying to hold back the tears that were running uncontrollably. Catalina, who remained a step behind, felt a lump in her throat. She saw how those words tore Juliana apart, but also how with each sentence he said, something inside him seemed to break, something that perhaps needed to break so that he could rebuild himself. Juliana took a deep breath, the air coming out in gasps. He looked at the gravestones again, his eyes filled with tears. But now I understand what Sophia wrote. She forgave me, but I could never do the same with myself, and without that, I remained trapped in a pain that never let me remember what was most important, the love I felt for you. He closed his eyes, his hands clenching the earth beneath his knees. I will never forget you, but I need to try to live for you, for me. Catalina took a step forward and knelt down beside him. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, waiting for him to look at her. When he finally did, she saw in Juliana's eyes a mixture of pain and determination, as if he were finally beginning to see a way out. Juliana spoke softly, but with conviction. The forgiveness you are asking for is not something that Sophia or Lucas would deny you, but the most important forgiveness is the one you need to give yourself. He squeezed his shoulder, a gesture full of strength and tenderness. Start slowly. Remember that you are human, that you made mistakes, but that you also loved deeply. Sophia knew that. She saw who you were and still believed in you. Believe in yourself too, Juliana, even if only a little, for today. He nodded slowly, tears still streaming down his face. But now his face showed something Catalina had not seen before, a glimmer of acceptance. He looked at the gravestones once more and murmured, his voice still broken, I'll try, for you, for me. Catalina hugged him, wrapping her arms around him as if she wanted to protect every broken part of him. You are not alone in this, even when you feel like you are. Remember, they are with you in every note you play, in every step you take. Their love never left. The silence that followed was full of meaning. Juliana remained there, still kneeling, but now with a slightly lighter heart. Catalina knew that this moment was not the end of the pain, but the beginning of something new, the first step toward the healing he had been seeking for so long. Juliana's nights had been marked by silence for years, a heavy silence filled with memories and regrets. But that night, something different was happening. Sitting in a corner with a borrowed guitar resting on his lap, he felt his fingers slide across the strings as if they were re-entering an old friend. The trip to the cemetery still echoed in his mind, the words he whispered to Sophia and Lucas, the forgiveness that was beginning to grow in his heart. Everything seemed to have been transformed into a new energy. Juliana wasn't sure where it came from, but he felt he needed to let it out in the form of music. He played the first chords hesitantly, as if trying to remember something long forgotten. But as his fingers found the notes, a melody began to emerge, timid but full of emotion. Juliana closed his eyes and images began to form in his mind. Lucas running in the garden, laughing, while Juliana played for him. Sophia sitting on the sofa, with a calm but loving look on her face, nodding her head to the rhythm of the music. The children from the orphanage, their voices singing along with him, their eyes shining as if the music were the only magic they needed to believe in something better. Tears welled up as he played, but this time they weren't just tears of sadness. There was something else, a nostalgia filled with gratitude, a love that was no longer there. Carved in the pain, the words began to emerge along with the notes, almost as if they had been waiting for him all along, for the laughter that echoes in his memory, for the hearts that were once home, for the little hands that held his, and for the love that will never cease to shine. The music flowed like a river finally finding its course. Each chord seemed to carry a piece of his journey, the nights of despair, the children who helped him remember how to smile, and the forgiveness he was finally beginning to give himself. When he finished, Juliana stood still for a moment, listening to the echo of the last notes. He looked at Catalina, who was watching him closely, tears running silently down her face. "It's for them," he said hoarsely, "for Sophia, for Lucas, and for the children at the orphanage. They helped me see that I can still give something good to the world, that I can still love." Catalina smiled, feeling the weight of his words. "They will feel it, Juliana, each and every one of them. and Sophia and Lucas too. I know they feel it. In the days that followed, Juliana continued to work on the song, on every detail. When he finally played it at the orphanage, surrounded by the children and staff, the whole room fell silent. The melody seemed to envelop everyone like a hug, and many eyes filled with tears, including his. The song was not just a tribute, it was a symbol of everything Juliana had lost, and everything he still had to offer. It was proof that even in pain, love could survive, and sometimes even flourish. Catalina had spent weeks by Juliana's side, guiding him through his own shadows, helping him face his pain and, little by little, find reasons to move forward. But as sincere as her dedication was, there was something she had never admitted, even to herself. She too carried wounds, deep scars that she avoided touching. One night, returning from the orphanage, Julie looked at her differently. "You always say I'm not alone," he commented in a voice full of caution. "But Catalina, you're not alone either. Who takes care of you?" The question struck her like a bolt of lightning. Catalina looked away, feigning a smile. But she knew Juliana was right. There were parts of herself that she kept locked away, afraid that facing them would break her. The next morning, with a heavy heart, Catalina decided it was time to face what she had been avoiding for years. She returned to the house where she grew up, a place she had left behind. After her sister's death, her mother welcomed her with a tight hug, the kind of hug that said more than words. "It's been so long, my daughter," her mother said, her eyes filled with emotion. Catalina walked through the house, now somewhat worn, but full of memories. Every corner seemed to whisper echoes of the past. In her sister's old room, she found a small wooden box on the dresser. It was something she knew existed, but had never had the courage to open. Inside the box were several letters, all carefully folded and addressed to her. Catalina felt her hands tremble as she took the first one, her heart racing. Finally, she opened it, and her sister's words seemed to travel through the years to reach her. "Catalina, I love you. I have always admired you for being so strong. But I realize that sometimes that strength prevents you from letting people in. You don't leave much room for them to love you. You always seem busy taking care of everyone. But who takes care of you? I wanted to tell you something I could never say out loud. Never stop believing in love. It is what keeps us alive, even when it seems that all is lost. I try, Catalina. I try every day. But honestly, I don't think I can. Sometimes the pain is stronger than the love." Catalina's tears began to fall before she could finish the letter. That was her sister's silent cry, a cry for help that she never heard while there was still time. When she finished reading, Catalina held the letter to her chest, feeling a mixture of pain and regret, but deep down, that sadness. There was also a seed of something new, an understanding that love, though imperfect, was still the most powerful force she could carry with her. As she left the room, Catalina looked at her mother and said, her voice still broken, "I can't change what happened to her, but I can change what I do with this. I think it's time to stop running away." Her mother smiled, wiping the tears from Catalina's face. "She wanted you to live, my daughter, not out of guilt, but out of love. I think it's time you did." At that moment, Catalina felt she was taking the first step toward caring for her own wounds, not by praying away the past, but by learning to live with it. The orphanage, once a simple building, filled with the scattered sounds of children playing, now seemed to pulsate with new energy. Catalina and Juliana had become part of the routine there, and their visits were not only expected, but desired. Every time they arrived, the children ran to them, their laughter echoing through the hallways like a melody that Juliana was beginning to recognize as the sound of healing. Catalina took on a more active role, organizing activities and creating spaces for the children to express their emotions. She, who had previously avoided looking at her own pain, now felt more connected to the purpose of transforming lives by helping others face their own struggles. Juliana, for his part, had found something in the guitar that had previously seemed lost. He played every day, and the children, many of whom had never heard live music before, sat around him, fascinated. The music filled the room, but it also filled something inside him, a void that was beginning to be replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. It was during one of those afternoons while he was tuning his guitar that Luce, the girl who was always nearby, approached him timidly, holding the same vinyl record. Juliana said in a soft voice, but one full of expectation. "Can you teach me to play? I want to learn. I want to be like you." Juliana paused, looking at her in surprise. There was something in Luce's eyes, an innocent admiration, and a thirst for something he understood very well, the need to connect, to find a place in the world. "Do you really want to learn?" he asked, smiling gently. Luce nodded enthusiastically, hugging the record more tightly. "My grandmother always said that music makes magic, and I want to make magic too." Juliana's smile widened, but at the same time, something inside him stirred, a feeling he didn't know how to name, but that felt like a familiar warmth. He couldn't help it. When he looked at Luce, he saw in her a reflection of Lucas, his son, with the same enthusiasm and sparkle in his eyes. "All right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's begin." Now Luce jumped for joy and ran to find a small guitar that was tucked away in a corner. It was old and unused, but for her, it was perfect. Juliana spent the afternoon teaching her the first chords, holding her hands to show her how to position her fingers. "See," he said, smiling as Luce tried to play a simple melody. "It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to come from the heart." Catalina, who was watching from afar, felt her heart shrink. She saw in Juliana a man who was finding pieces of himself in each child, especially in Luce. At the same time, she knew that Luce was also gaining something precious, someone who believed in her. At the end of the day, Luce looked at Juliana and said, "Do you think I'll ever be able to play as well as you?" He put his hand on her head and gently ruffled her hair. "I think you're already playing better than me, Luce, because you play with your heart." The orphanage hall was full with children and employees, all gathered to see the performance that Juliana had organized with his young students. The simple walls were decorated with drawings made by the children, and a small improvised stage filled the room with anticipation. Luce was sitting next to Catalina, holding the guitar that Juliana had taught her to play. When Juliana took the stage, applause and laughter filled the room. He looked at Catalina, who gave him an encouraging smile, but it was when he looked at Luce with her bright eyes and the guitar in her hands that he felt a knot in his heart. He took a deep breath, holding his own guitar tightly. "This song is for you," he said in a soft voice, but full of emotion, "and for all those who teach us to keep going, even when life seems impossible." Then he began to play. The melody was delicate but intense. Each note seemed to carry pieces of his journey, the pain of losing Sophia and Lucas, the guilt that had consumed him, but also the hope he found in the orphanage and in the children who helped him rediscover himself. When Juliana began to sing, his voice trembled slightly, but soon gained strength. The words spoke of love, loss, and that light that always remains, even in the darkest moments. The entire room fell silent, the children watching with fascinated eyes. Catalina, sitting in the back, felt tears running silently down her face. But she was not the only one. Juliana was also crying as he played, tears running down his face. But there was something different about them. They were not just tears of pain, they were tears of acceptance from a man who was learning to carry his past without letting it crush him. And behind those tears was a peaceful smile. When the song ended, the room filled with applause and laughter. Juliana looked at Luce, who ran towards him with the guitar in her hands. "I'm going to learn to play like that someday," she said with childlike enthusiasm that seemed to light up everything. Juliana bent down and held her little hands. "You already play more than you realize." That night, as he put away the instruments, Juliana made a decision. He wanted that song, which represented everything he had lived through, to be shared. He decided to record it, not only as a tribute to Sophia and Lucas, but also as a thank you to the children who had brought light back into his life. He called the song Luce, Light, in honor of the girl who had shown him that it was still possible to find clarity in the darkness. The afternoon at the orphanage was painted with the soft glow of the sun shining through the windows. filling the room with golden light. The children ran and played, their laughter echoing in the space while Luce, with her little guitar, led a group singing a song that Juliana had taught them weeks earlier. Outside on the balcony overlooking the courtyard, Catalina and Juliana watched in silence. He leaned against the railing with a calm smile on his face, while Catalina stood beside him, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the children. "Do you remember what it was like when we first arrived here?" Juliana asked, breaking the silence. Catalina nodded, her expression softening. "Actually, I think I was as lost as you." Juliana looked at her with eyes full of gratitude. "You saved me, Catalina. I don't know if I could have done it without you." She shook her head, smiling slightly. "You always had that strength inside you, Juliana. You just needed someone to remind you." They both looked back at the courtyard. Luz had finished her song and was surrounded by other children who applauded her enthusiastically. Catalina felt a warmth spreading in her chest, as if that moment were more than a happy scene. It was the confirmation of something she didn't know she was looking for. "Those children," Juliana began in a soft voice, "have given me more than I could ever give them back. They taught me how to live again." He looked at Catalina, his expression now more serious. "And you taught me to believe that was possible." Catalina felt her eyes fill with tears, but this time it wasn't sadness. It was a deep relief, the feeling that she had finally found a place, a reason. "You helped me too, Juliana," she said, her voice trembling. "Helping you made me realize that I needed to heal too. And somehow, I think we did it, together." For a moment, they remained silent, both absorbing the meaning of that moment. It wasn't just the orphanage or the children. It was what they had built together, a space of hope where the pain of the past no longer defined who they were. Juliana smiled, looking at Catalina Ina with a twinkle in his eyes. "You know what I see when I look at those children?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "A new opportunity," he replied, turning his gaze back to the courtyard. "To live, to love, to do something that matters." Catalina felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't try to hide it. "I see the same thing," she said, smiling. At that moment, the sound of loud laughter caught their attention. It was Luce running toward Juliana with the guitar in her hands. "Can you play another song?" she shouted. "Everyone wants to hear it." He laughed, reaching out to take the guitar. "Of course, Luce. Let's go." Catalina watched him join the children, playing with an energy that she knew came from the heart, as she looked at the group around him, with Luce leading with the confidence of someone who knows they are safe. Catalina felt that for the first time in a long time, her heart was light. Looking at Juliana and the children, she knew that they had both found something valuable there. Not only a new opportunity to live, but a new family, a purpose that connected them to something bigger than themselves. It was there, in that orphanage full of laughter and music, where they had finally begun to heal.